Did everyone who was looking for a seat find one? Good evening. Good evening. Good evening. Thank you very much for coming out tonight. My name is Dr. Keith Champagne. I serve as the Associate Dean for Student Development here at Central Washington University, and I'm also a member of the Mass Incarceration Racial Justice Project, Black and Brown Lives Do Matter Committee. That's a mouthful. So welcome to tonight's program. Tonight's program is part of the Social Justice and Human Rights series and the year-long Mass Incarceration and Racial Justice Project, Black and Brown Lives Do Matter. Our sponsors for tonight's program are the Law and Justice Department, the Sociology Department, the Center for Diversity and Social Justice, with special thanks to Ms. Michelle Cyrus and the Campus Life Publicity Center. And for more information on the upcoming programs throughout the month of November and winter quarter and spring quarter, you can go to the Mass Incarceration's webpage. So at this time, I'd like to welcome our Associate Provost for Faculty Affairs, Ms. Ann Kubley, who will introduce tonight's speaker.
Hi, thank you all for being here tonight and welcome. Thank you very much, Keith. It's my very great pleasure to welcome Mr. David Fathi here tonight. Mr. Fathi is one of this country's most distinguished public intellectuals and voices for justice, fairness, and human rights. As the director of the American Civil Liberties Union National Prison Project, Mr. Fathi specializes in legal challenges to conditions of confinement in prisons and jails throughout the United States. Mr. Fathi graduated summa cum laude and with college honors from the University of Washington, and went on to earn his JD from UC Berkeley's Bolt Hall School of Law. As well as his work for the ACLU, for which he first went to work in 1990, Mr. Fathi has served as the director of the U.S. program for Human Rights Watch, as a staff attorney for Columbia Legal Services Institutions Project in Seattle, and at the British Columbia Public Interest Advocacy Center. Mr. Fathi's bar admissions include the Supreme Court of the United States, as well as the Supreme Courts of Washington and California, United States Courts of Appeals for the 4th, 7th, 9th, and 10th Circuits, and numerous U.S. district courts. Mr. Fathi has published numerous reports, law review articles, and editorials, and is a regular public speaker and invited lecturer. Mr. Fathi is here tonight to present a talk titled Prisons, Mass Incarceration, and Racial Justice. As a token of Central's esteem and a small thanks for your visit to our campus, our classrooms, and for your lecture here tonight, please accept this small gift on behalf of the university, and please join me in welcoming Mr. David Fathi.
Thank you so much for this that very generous introduction, and thank you so much for the gift. I've had a wonderful visit to your beautiful town and campus, and this will help me remember. It's a pleasure to be back in Washington, where I've spent important periods of my life. Washington is also the state that has given this country one of its greatest civil libertarians, Supreme Court Justice William O. Douglas. And it's a special pleasure to be here tonight with all of you. If mass incarceration ends, it will be because enough people care enough to do something about it. And your presence here tonight is an important part of that. The ACLU established the National Prison Project in 1972. Since that time, we have represented literally tens of thousands of men, women, and children in challenges to dangerous and inhumane conditions in prisons, jails, and juvenile detention facilities all across the United States. Our goal is a criminal justice system that protects public safety while respecting individual rights and protecting the health, safety, and human dignity of prisoners. We recognize that incarcerated people remain part of our society and that the vast majority of them will one day return to our communities. The United States is the world's leading prison nation. With less than 5% of the world's population, we have 1/4 of the world's prisoners. On any given day, there are more than 2.3 million people behind bars in our prisons and jails, more than the entire population of many U.S. states. This is the largest prison system in the world, a bigger prison population than China, a country 4 times larger than the United States. When you look at incarceration rates, the number of prisoners per 100,000 people in the population, the United States is, once again, number 1 in the world, with an incarceration rate that is 5 to 10 times higher than in Europe, in Canada, in Australia, and other countries that we normally think of as our peer nations. Many of you have probably been to Canada. It's not very far away, and it's a very similar society in many ways. But the United States has a per capita incarceration rate 6 times higher than Canada's. Why is that? Does it have to be that way? These are questions we should be asking ourselves and our public officials. 50 years ago, even 30 years ago, it was unthinkable that the United States, known as the leader of the free world, would also be the world's leading incarcerator. In 1980, the U.S. prison population was about 300,000, less than 1/7 what it is today. And sociologists and other experts talked openly of the eventual end of incarceration as an ineffective and outdated response to crime. In 1973, the National Advisory Commission on Criminal Justice recommended that no new adult prisons should be built, and existing juvenile prisons should be closed. This recommendation was based on the Commission's conclusion that the prison, the reformatory, and the jail have achieved only a shocking level of failure. There is overwhelming evidence that these institutions create crime rather than prevent it. So how did we get from there to here? We cannot discuss the criminal justice system in the United States without discussing the racism that still infects every corner of that system, and indeed every corner of our society. Black men are more than 6 times as likely as white men to be incarcerated. And this disparity holds even for crimes like drug crimes that we know whites and blacks commit at very similar rates. In 2006, 1 in every 9 black men between ages 20 and 34 was behind bars, a rate of incarceration that has never before existed in this country or, to my knowledge, in any other. Racial disparities with respect to the incarceration of Latinos are less extreme, but still very significant. Mass incarceration is, in many respects, the direct lineal descendant of slavery. The story begins almost immediately after slavery was abolished by the 13th Amendment following the Civil War. Facing the immediate loss of 4 million slaves, Southern rulers turned to incarceration to ensure continuing access to the cheap labor of African Americans. Criminal laws were passed that targeted the newly freed slaves, laws that were either explicitly racist or selectively enforced against African Americans. For example, one law required that all free Negroes and mulattoes over the age of 18 had to provide written proof of a job at the beginning of the year. Those who could not were deemed vagrants and incarcerated. And by the way, the purpose of this arrangement was not subtle or hidden. It was openly discussed in the newspapers and elsewhere that the purpose of these laws was to control and essentially to re-enslave the black population. Along with the growing incarceration of African Americans came the convict lease system, which allowed states to rent out prisoners to the highest bidder. Tens of thousands of African American prisoners were leased like animals to work on plantations, railroads, lumber camps, and other private businesses. The abuses were horrific. Unlike the slave owner, who at least had some financial incentive to keep his slaves alive and healthy enough to work, the businesses leasing convict labor had no such incentive. Death rates were shockingly high, with many prisoners literally worked to death. Douglas Blackmun appropriately titled his book on the convict lease system, Slavery by Another Name. A similar book by David Oshinsky is simply titled Worse Than Slavery. And ever since that time, the criminal justice system has been a key mechanism for controlling the African American population. Fast forward to the late 20th century. In 1982, President Ronald Reagan launched his war on drugs. Contrary to popular belief, this had nothing to do with the so-called crack epidemic that actually came 3 years later. In 1982, there was no evidence that drug abuse was any more of a problem than it had been at any other time. And in fact, there was some evidence that it was actually declining. And less than 2% of Americans thought drug abuse was the most important issue facing the country. But that didn't matter. Almost overnight, funding for arrest and prosecution of drug crimes soared, even as funding for prevention and treatment of drug abuse declined. The war on drugs was given a huge shot in the arm by the appearance of crack cocaine in 1985. Crack was a significant public health problem and did contribute to a temporary spike in violence as drug dealers battled for turf and market share. But politicians and a credulous media fanned the flames of hysteria with highly racialized stories about crack babies and gangbangers, many of which turned out to be simply untrue. And through this relentless drumbeat of exaggeration and misrepresentation, drugs in general and crack in particular became inextricably linked in the public mind with African Americans. Over the next several years, Congress passed a series of increasingly draconian drug laws, introducing mandatory minimum sentences for drug offenses, including a mandatory 5-year sentence for simple possession of 5 grams of crack cocaine. That's about 1/6 of an ounce. By contrast, it took 500 grams, or more than a pound, of powder cocaine to trigger the same 5-year sentence, even though the two drugs are pharmacologically virtually identical. This is the infamous 100-to-1 disparity between penalties for crack and powder cocaine. Defendants charged with possessing crack are overwhelmingly black, while those charged with possessing powder cocaine are mostly white. Most state legislatures followed Congress's lead and passed similarly harsh drug laws. And I want to make clear that all of this was a thoroughly bipartisan project. According to the Justice Policy Institute, President Bill Clinton's criminal justice policies, including the 1994 crime bill he signed, resulted in the largest increase in state and federal prison populations of any president in U.S. history. And it wasn't long before the new punitiveness spread well beyond drugs. In 1993, Washington became one of the first states to pass a 3-strikes law, providing for an automatic life sentence upon conviction of a third violent felony. Other states quickly copied Washington's law. Some states went even further and passed two-strikes laws. At one point, there were 40,000 prisoners in California alone serving time pursuant to its two-strikes and three-strikes laws. California's law was challenged, but was upheld by the United States Supreme Court, which ruled that a sentence of 25 years to life for a man who stole 3 golf clubs, and a sentence of 50 years to life for a man who shoplifted some children's videos from Kmart did not violate the Constitution's prohibition on cruel and unusual punishment. In short, beginning in the 1980s, this country began to move steadily toward increasingly rigid and punitive sentencing practices. The abolition of parole, determinate sentencing, which severely restricts judges' discretion, so-called truth in sentencing, which limits the time prisoners can earn for good behavior, mandatory minimums, 3-strikes laws, 2-strikes laws. These have all combined to create a situation where the United States has, by now, and by quite a large margin, the longest prison sentences in the democratic world. Today, right now, more than 3,200 people in this country are serving sentences of life without the possibility of parole for nonviolent crimes. Let me repeat that. Over 3,000 people are serving sentences of life without any possibility of parole for nonviolent crimes. Virtually every time legislators have voted to make punishments even more harsh and more punitive, the image of the black criminal has been lurking in the background. It's rarely said explicitly, but then it doesn't have to be. Code words like predator, gangbanger, crack dealer, drug kingpin convey the message all too well. But once these laws are passed, of course, they don't apply only to black people. They apply to whites, to Latinos, to everyone. And that's why, even though they are grossly overrepresented, black people are still only a minority of the U.S. prison population, about 37%. And even if we released every single black person from prison tomorrow, we'd still have an incarceration rate far higher than our peer nations. And so, and this is a critical point, racism and racial animus lead to mass incarceration in ways that go beyond just locking up large numbers of black people. Racism and racial animus lead to laws and policies that increase incarceration across the board. Now, that said, it is certainly true that discriminatory enforcement of facially neutral laws in ways that disadvantage African Americans is rampant. One fascinating example is described by Catherine Beckett and her colleagues at the University of Washington in a 2005 study of drug law enforcement in Seattle. They found that the police had decided to concentrate their drug enforcement efforts on crack, even though heroin and other drugs resulted in far more overdoses and deaths. They decided to concentrate on open-air drug markets, even though they received far more complaints about drug dealing in residences. And the researchers found that even in open-air drug markets, black sellers were far more likely to be arrested than white sellers, even when white sellers were present and visible. So this shows all the ways that the exercise of discretion by police and other actors in the criminal justice system at every point in the process can lead to racially disparate outcomes. But there are other factors, in addition to racism, that have given us the bloated prison population we have today. Our lack of a public mental health system also plays a role in mass incarceration. It's extremely difficult for low-income or uninsured people, particularly if they're homeless or have otherwise chaotic lives, to get mental health treatment in the community. With their mental illness untreated, they deteriorate, and in many cases, their behavior eventually leads to arrest, prosecution, and incarceration. As a result, prisons and jails have become the asylums of last resort, with anywhere from 1/3 to over a half of the prisoner population suffering from mental illness. The largest mental health facility in the United States today is the Cook County Jail in Chicago. Another factor is what we might call too much democracy. In many countries, sentencing policy is determined by career professionals who are usually experts in the field and are pretty well insulated from political pressure. Judges and prosecutors are civil servants and also enjoy a high level of job security. By contrast, in the United States, prosecutors are elected officials, and in many states, including this one, even judges are elected, a procedure that is unique in the world. And in many states, again including Washington, voters themselves can directly make criminal law and sentencing law through the initiative and referendum process, bypassing the legislature entirely. And what all this leads to is a kind of one-way ratchet where every election year, judges and prosecutors compete with their political opponents to see who can be tougher and harsher, and every high-profile crime is followed by new and more harsh and more punitive sentencing laws. In 1986, 3 of the 7 justices on the California Supreme Court, including the Chief Justice, were removed by voters after a campaign in which they were accused of being soft on crime. In many states, 3 strikes laws were passed not because there was any evidence that they would actually reduce crime, but in response to a single, particularly horrific individual crime. Some have theorized that our incarceration rate is related to our culture, that as a highly individualistic, sink-or-swim society, we are more willing to essentially write off a portion of our population, consigning them to years or decades of incarceration, than are other societies with stronger traditions of collectivism and social solidarity. And the British scholar Nicola Lacey has shown that countries with more laissez-faire and unregulated economic systems, including the United Kingdom and especially the United States, tend to have higher incarceration rates than countries with more mixed economies. Whatever its causes, and there are certainly many, our enormous prison population, a level of incarceration unprecedented in the history of this nation or any other, is by itself a national crisis. But there's more. In some states, mass incarceration has led to serious prison overcrowding. What does this mean? Every prison is designed to hold a certain number of prisoners. It has enough cells, enough medical facilities, enough toilets, enough exercise space for that number of people. As that number is exceeded, critical systems are increasingly stressed and at some point break down altogether. It becomes impossible to provide adequate medical and mental health care. There aren't enough bunks, so prisoners have to sleep on the floor. Communicable disease like tuberculosis becomes a greater risk. The physical plant, the toilets, sinks, showers break down from overuse. The prison becomes an unhealthy and dangerous place for everyone, prisoners and staff alike. In 2011, the United States Supreme Court decided Brown versus Plata, a case involving the California prison system. The court found that extreme overcrowding, close to 200% of capacity system-wide and nearly 300% at some individual prisons, had made it impossible to provide prisoners with minimally adequate medical and mental health care. The result, in the court's words, was needless suffering and death. California was given 2 years to reduce its prison population to a mere 137% of capacity. Here are just a few of the examples the court gave of the consequences of California's prison crowding. Because of a shortage of treatment beds, suicidal inmates may be held for prolonged periods in telephone booth-sized cages without toilets. A psychiatric expert reported observing an inmate who had been held in such a cage for nearly 24 hours, standing in a pool of his urine, unresponsive and nearly catatonic. Prison officials explained that they had no place to put him. A correctional officer testified that in one prison, up to 50 sick inmates may be held together in a 12 by 20-foot cage for up to 5 hours awaiting treatment. A prisoner with severe abdominal pain died after a 5-week delay in referral to a specialist. A prisoner with constant and extreme chest pain died after an 8-hour delay in evaluation by a doctor. Cramped conditions promote unrest and violence, making it difficult for prison officials to monitor and control the prison population. After one prisoner was assaulted in a crowded gymnasium, prison staff did not even learn of the injury until the prisoner had been dead for several hours. Because of the Supreme Court's order, California's prison population has been substantially reduced since 2011. But significant overcrowding still exists in many states, as well as in the federal prison system. Another practice that has emerged alongside the growth of mass incarceration is the use of long-term solitary confinement. And to make this concrete, I'd like to ask you to imagine an average-sized parking space. Now imagine that parking space has walls and a ceiling made of solid concrete and a solid steel door. There's a small window in the door so you can see into the hallway, but there's no window to the outside, so there's no natural light. Now imagine that you live alone in that space. You eat there, you sleep there, you use the toilet there, you may even shower there. 3 times a day, a guard opens a small trap door in the cell door and slides a food tray in. 3 times a week, if you're lucky, if it's not canceled, you're taken to a slightly larger concrete cell. The ceiling is partially open so you can see the sky. But like the cell where you live, the walls are solid and there are no windows, so you never see the horizon, or a tree, or a blade of grass. Now imagine that this is your life, not for a day, or for a week, or 2 weeks, but for months, years, or even decades. This is the reality of solitary confinement in the United States. Today, right now, thousands of prisoners are held in these conditions in the United States. Many are held in so-called supermax prisons, which are designed and built expressly to hold prisoners in long-term solitary confinement. Supermax prisons have no dining hall, no gym, no recreation yard, no library, and no classroom space. All of these things would be useless in a supermax prison because the prisoners are locked in their cells for all but 5 or 6 hours a week. Although supermax prisons were rare in the United States before the 1990s, today 44 states and the federal government have supermax units or facilities, housing at least 25,000 people nationwide. But this figure doesn't reflect the total number of prisoners held in solitary confinement. Using data from the Bureau of Justice Statistics, researchers estimated that over 80,000 prisoners are held in some form of restricted housing involving substantial social isolation. In its use of solitary confinement, as in the size of its prison population, the United States is an egregious global outlier. Solitary confinement exists in many countries, but in no other democratic state, indeed, in no other state of any description, to my knowledge, is solitary confinement such a routine and normalized and integral part of the criminal justice system. And the United States is unique both in the frequency of its use of solitary confinement and in its duration. In a 2009 report on one single supermax prison in Illinois, investigative journalists found more than 50 prisoners who had been held in continuous solitary confinement for more than 10 years. Solitary confinement is difficult for anyone to bear. Here's what Senator John McCain said of his time in solitary, about 2 years, as a prisoner of war in Vietnam. He said, "It's an awful thing, solitary. It crushes your spirit and weakens your resistance more effectively than any other form of mistreatment." Sarah Shourd is one of 3 American hikers who were imprisoned in Iran beginning in 2009. She was held in solitary confinement for 410 days. Here's how she describes that experience. "My mind began to slip. I suffered from insomnia, nightmares, hallucinations, and emotional detachment, and often had violent panic attacks. More than once, I completely lost control and began screaming and beating at the walls of my cell until my knuckles bled. I started to realize that there was a slow disintegration, really, of my personality, my sense of who I was." In an article titled "The Worst Scars Are in the Mind," a Red Cross psychiatrist compared solitary confinement to physical torture, noting that being confined for prolonged periods of time alone in a cell has been said to be the most difficult torment of all to withstand, a comment made, moreover, by hardened prisoners used to rigorous conditions and abuse. A California prison psychiatrist put it a bit more succinctly, saying, "It's a standard psychiatric concept. If you put people in isolation, they will go insane. Most people in isolation will fall apart." Now, these are the effects of solitary confinement on people who were previously psychologically healthy and intact. The effects of solitary confinement on people with pre-existing mental illness are absolutely shattering. When these people are subjected to the stress of solitary confinement, they deteriorate dramatically. Many engage in bizarre and extreme acts of self-mutilation, cutting off parts of their bodies, puncturing their flesh, repeatedly smashing their heads against walls, swallowing razors, and attempting to hang themselves. In one solitary confinement unit in Indiana, that my office sued, a prisoner with mental illness in solitary burned himself alive. Another mentally ill man choked himself to death with a washcloth. And there are children in solitary confinement. Here in Washington, I once visited a 13-year-old boy who was being held in solitary in prison. He wasn't yet old enough to shave. His voice hadn't changed yet, but he was in solitary confinement. I once represented a 17-year-old boy who was in the most isolating unit of Wisconsin's Supermax prison. He had a history of severe mental illness going back to the age of 9 and had already tried to hang himself in prison. Since his transfer to solitary confinement, his mental health had deteriorated dramatically. A psychiatrist working with us concluded that he was suffering from severe depression and was at extremely high risk of suicide. Fortunately, a federal judge ordered that he be immediately removed from solitary confinement. But most others in his situation aren't so lucky. Given these severe risks of harm, in 2012, the American Psychiatric Association adopted a policy recommending that persons with serious mental illness not be subjected to prolonged solitary confinement, which it defined as more than 3 to 4 weeks. The American Academy of Child and Adolescent Psychiatry has called for a ban on the solitary confinement of children. The United Nations Special Rapporteur on Torture has recommended the categorical exclusion of people with mental illness and children. He has concluded that solitary confinement can amount to torture prohibited by UN treaty obligations and recommends an absolute cap on solitary confinement of no more than 15 days. Nevertheless, this inhumane and dangerous practice continues in Washington and in virtually every other state. There is, however, some good news. After more than 30 years of relentless increase, the U.S. prison population has actually declined slightly in the last few years. This is very much a state-by-state phenomenon. In some states, it's gone down, while in other states, including Washington, it's gone up. But the fact that the national total has at least stopped growing is a very positive sign. The question is whether this is a temporary blip or a real turning point. Also, it's possible that while the overall prison population declines, racial disparities could actually get worse. And I just this morning saw an article that suggests that this might actually be happening, although I think it's too early to draw any definitive conclusions. So what can you do? First, you can join and support and work with the ACLU. We have made fighting mass incarceration a top national priority, and the ACLU of Washington is doing heroic work in this area. I'm happy to say that Jamie Hawk from the ACLU of Washington, from the office in Seattle, is here with us tonight, and if you're interested in working with us, you can talk with her afterwards. Jamie, would you identify yourself? Thank you. Our Stop Solitary campaign is a national and increasingly international campaign to end the torture of solitary confinement. We need your help. In the final analysis, this is about the kind of choices we make as a society. Every country in the world has crime. Every country in the world has drug abuse. But some have chosen to deal with it in a different way. In the late 1990s, Portugal decriminalized personal possession of all drugs and redirected money from prosecution and incarceration to prevention and treatment. 10 years later, drug abuse and addiction, as well as HIV infection, had plummeted, and drug-related crime had declined as well. Washington's recent legalization of marijuana possession is a step in the same positive direction. I'm a lawyer, and I sue prisons for a living. Thank you. But I'm here to tell you that the road to the end of mass incarceration runs through the ballot box, not the courthouse. The laws and policies that have brought us mass incarceration were passed by elected representatives, and they can be, and they must be, repealed by those same representatives. And so the most important thing you can do is elect leaders who understand that it doesn't have to be this way, who understand that another way is possible, who understand that you don't fight drug abuse by locking people in cages. You fight drug abuse by building the kind of society that people want to live in rather than escape from. I'd like to close with words from the British social reformers Beatrice and Sidney Webb. They wrote these words in Great Britain nearly a century ago, in 1922, but I think they are every bit as relevant here and now. We suspect that it passes the wit of man to contrive a prison which shall not be gravely injurious to the minds of the vast majority of prisoners, if not also to their bodies. So far as can be seen at present, the most practical and hopeful of prison reforms is to keep people out of prison altogether. I could not say it any better than that. Thank you very much. Thank you. I'd be happy to take questions and comments. I think there's a microphone.
I have two questions. What do you think is the impact of private prisons on mass incarceration? And also, what do you have an opinion about
Okay. Private prisons, my own view is that private prisons are a contributor to mass incarceration, but not a terribly significant one. Private prisons, although they've grown substantially in the last 30 years, they still house less than 10% of the prison population. It's higher in some states than others. It's higher in the federal prison system than in most state prison systems, but it's not a big factor. Obviously, it's problematic that a whole industry has grown up that has a financial incentive in maintaining and indeed expanding mass incarceration, and the ACLU has long opposed private prisons as a matter of policy. But as an empirical matter, I don't think they are a major driver of mass incarceration. As for sentences of life without parole as an alternative to the death penalty, obviously any sentence where the prisoner remains alive is preferable to the death penalty. The ACLU is an abolitionist organization and opposes the death penalty in all circumstances. Nevertheless, I do think sentences of life without parole in which a person, perhaps a very young person, is given absolutely no opportunity to show after 20, 40, 50 years redemption and rehabilitation, I do think that's problematic, but again, as an alternative to the death penalty, it is certainly a lesser evil.
I feel like a lot of the time, mental health care is something that people point to as an alternative to prison, or just that's one of the few places that you can send prisoners instead of overcrowding for people with mental health issues. So, what's the barrier keeping people from really focusing on, I guess legislators focusing on actually improving access to quality mental health care?
Well, it's the same old problem that we are the only advanced democracy that does not guarantee health care to all of its citizens and residents as a matter of right, both physical and mental health care. I hope that this will change somewhat as the Affordable Care Act rolls out and more people who lack coverage get coverage, but as I said, it's very difficult, particularly for low-income or uninsured people in the community, to access mental health care, and it is an entirely foreseeable consequence that some portion of those people, untreated, will end up in the criminal justice system. So I think it's fundamentally a lack of political will, and again, I hope that we'll see some improvement with the ACA.
I was wondering if you could educate us a little bit on the continuation or the economics of prison and who's benefiting from this free or cheap labor, and if you can actually give us scenarios or examples of the different corporations that are doing that.
Mm-hmm. There are a lot of corporations that use prison labor and that benefit from having a uniquely docile and literally captive workforce. I'm sorry, I'm drawing a blank on any particular examples, but prisoners, if it can be done in a prison, prisoners do it. Prisoners staff call centers, prisoners grow produce for, I think Whole Foods just recently agreed they would stop buying prison-produced products. And I'm actually conflicted about this because, of course, on one level, it's exploitive and it probably undercuts the position of free labor to the extent that companies use prison labor instead of free labor. On the other hand, most prisoners desperately want to work and earn a little bit of money and maybe learn a useful skill that can prepare them for reentry. And so I actually feel very conflicted about this phenomenon for the reasons I've explained.
That's a continuation of what you just said. What would have to change in order for recidivism rates to go down? Like, what do you see as structures in the country that might have to be put into place so that prisoners had a way out of prison?
Well, how much time do you have? I mean, one development that's very exciting is the ban the box movement, and I don't know if you've heard about that or if it's really on the radar screen here in Washington, but it's a movement to pass legislation that would prohibit employers from inquiring about criminal convictions at the outset of the process. They would still, before making an offer to a candidate, be allowed to ask about convictions, so before the actual hire. But what this would do is allow former prisoners to at least get their foot in the door, at least be evaluated in the early stages on their merits, and not be immediately screened out because they have checked the box that says they have a criminal conviction. You know, I think our prison system is, well, it depends what we want it to do. If we want it to prepare people for leading productive, law-abiding lives after prison, it is a dismal failure. And I don't know too many prison administrators who would actually disagree with that. If you look at European countries, particularly Scandinavian countries, they have a fundamentally different approach to incarceration. Incarceration is to punish, yes, but it's also sort of to fix this person and prepare this person to rejoin society as a productive member of the community. And it shows in the way their prisons are run and the investments that they make in their prison. I was talking to the director of the Colorado prison system who had just been visiting Swedish prisons, and I said, what's the big difference? I'm sure there's a bunch, but what's the big one? And he said the staffing ratio. They have a 1-to-1 staffing ratio, and we have in Colorado 1-to-7 or 1-to-8. He said, give me a 1-to-1 staffing ratio and I will work miracles. But we have not made we have made the social choice not to invest those kinds of resources in prisons.
Thank you. I don't know if it's good social science, but I do believe that the theme of American exceptionalism seems to be a big part of what drives incarceration and a lack of social democracy and the general tolerance for mass cruelty in all kinds of ways in this country. And you've mentioned several times, interestingly, productively, what Portugal does, what Scandinavia does. And I'm so frustrated because I feel that there's so much that we can learn, should learn in this country from the examples of other countries. But it seems to be a problem in this country that we're not willing to listen and look at other models and legal procedures because of we're exceptional. I'm just wondering, in terms of your own sharing examples of other countries, how other countries do it, what we can learn from other countries. I mean, how do you get through to Americans? Have you found strategies for having people in this country take a serious look at what others are doing? Yeah.
Or to quote Hillary Clinton, this isn't Denmark. And yeah, we definitely get that attitude a lot. The good news that I can share with you is that the corrections professionals are willing to look and learn. And a number of corrections professionals, including Bernie Warner, who's just unfortunately stepping down as Secretary of Corrections in this state, have traveled to other countries to see how they do things differently and in some ways better. So the practitioners are willing to learn. I think it's the politicians and the voters that we need to get through to. And, you know, I have no magic bullet for that, but certainly one argument that's getting more resonance than it used to is the cost. That incarceration, even on the cheap, the way we do it in this country, incarceration is still very, very expensive. And best estimate is that our incarceration system as a whole costs about $70 billion a year. And in a time where many states are still struggling with the aftermath of the financial crash, that argument is getting more attention than it used to. But it's still, you correctly identify a barrier that we have in making those arguments.
Sorry, I'm really nervous. Do you feel with the lawsuits that you've compiled over a given time that your organization could possibly be the backbone to a new prison reform?
Well, we aspire. That's what we aspire to be. You know, I have to say, litigation is is a terrible way of reforming large, complex bureaucracies. But it's also often the last resort. And we never sue before really exhausting every other possibility to try to resolve problems without litigation. But when that doesn't work, we will pull the trigger and file the lawsuit. And I think in the aggregate, the lawsuits that we have brought and others have brought have really transformed the prisons and have introduced a level of accountability and transparency and oversight that didn't exist before. That said, we still have a long way to go, and it is definitely a continuing effort to achieve what you mentioned and what is our ultimate goal. Yes?
It kind of goes back to the question about American exceptionalism. You noted that countries with more deregulation and less fair economic policies tend to have higher incarceration rates. And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit more about that in maybe a more explicit way.
Okay. And again, this is not my idea. This is Nicola Lacey in a book called The Prisoner's Dilemma, which I think was actually a lecture that she gave. And in the first instance, it's just an empirical finding. If you sort of arrange countries according to their economic, sort of the broad outlines of their economic system, and you look at incarceration rates, there is a correlation between the more laissez-faire, unregulated economies have the higher incarceration rates, the more sort of collectivist economies have lower. I'm trying to remember what her hypotheses were about why that may be. She noted that, and this may not be exactly the same, but that countries with sort of highly developed, for example, high-tech economies tend to really value every potential worker and see everyone as a contributor. And so incarceration is a last resort, should last as short a time as possible, and should prepare people to come back. Whereas in countries with large, low-wage service sectors like the United States, it's easier to regard some people as basically expendable. And if these people get locked up and don't come back or come back profoundly damaged, well, we really don't care so much about that. Again, it's a provocative hypothesis, and I think she makes a persuasive case. But as I said, I think there are probably many causes of our unique incarceration rate, and I certainly think that the legacy of slavery is a major determinant of how we got where we are today. Yeah.
I want to follow up on what Jay was asking a little while ago about the comparative prison conditions, particularly solitary confinement. How do U.S. solitary confinement conditions compare with those in other countries? And is it possible to use those as a mirror for the collective humanity of nations?
To answer the first part of your question, many countries, maybe even most countries, use solitary confinement to some extent, but it's generally used much less and for much shorter periods of time. Many European countries use it primarily pre-trial, which has its own problems because to the extent that you're putting someone who's pre-trial in very harsh and painful conditions, that's arguably, or it's unquestionably coercive and may force people to plead guilty, to confess to a crime that perhaps they didn't commit, and so on. But you don't see in other countries, certainly in Western European countries, as you do here, people in solitary confinement for 10, 20, 30 years continuously. The good news, as I mentioned earlier, is that the corrections professionals, I don't know any corrections professional who doesn't think that solitary confinement in the U.S. is overused, abused, inappropriately used, and they are very interested in learning specifically on this issue from other systems. So I know that we're already seeing reform in some states, and I think that will continue to to accelerate. So there is learning going on, at least in this one field.
Second part of it,
Oh, I'm sorry.
the collective humanity.
And what was the?
You use it as a measure
Uh-huh.
for collective humanity of a country.
I certainly think it's one indicator. I mean, to the extent that a country makes widespread use of a condition that is widely considered to be torture, I think that's a significant indicator of that country's humanity. I mean, there are many others. I certainly think just the size of our prison population does not speak well of our collective humanity, but the conditions for those in prison, whatever the size of the prison population, are obviously significant as well.
Thank you, David, for a really wonderful talk. I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about women's experience in prison in particular. I'm thinking about the problems of sexual assault in particular, pregnancy in prison, visitation rights, issues like that. I know that women are a smaller percentage of the prison population, but my understanding is that actually that's growing. So if you could say a few words about that.
I mean, that's absolutely right. Women are a small percentage, under 10% of the prison population. But if you look at growth over time, it's actually a very rapidly growing population. And women really are the sort of forgotten, the afterthought of prison. Prison was really designed for young men because that's who commits most of the crimes. And so until recently, that was a model that worked pretty well because that was really most of who was in prison. But now you have an increasing, rapidly growing female prisoner population. You also have a very rapidly growing elderly prison population, which raises its own problems. But yeah, prison's bad for everybody, but I'd say it's especially bad for women because it just hasn't been, in most systems, thought out well how to accommodate for the fact that most women in prison, unlike most men in prison, were custodial parents before they entered prison. The fact that women can get pregnant and men can't, and many women either come into jail, usually pregnant, and some of them get pregnant while they're in prison. The whole issue of shackling prisoners in labor has been a huge human rights concern, and fortunately through our advocacy and that of many others, many states have enacted restrictions or bans on the shackling of pregnant prisoners. Sexual harassment and abuse of female prisoners is rampant. Again, thanks to the implementation of the Prison Rape Elimination Act and generally the growing consciousness around this issue, I think my anecdotal sense is it's getting better, but it's still a huge problem. Washington State, to its credit, the Washington State prison system excluded male staff from certain private housing areas in the women's prison, was sued by the guards union for sex discrimination and successfully defended that policy before the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals. So there is progress, but it's slow and incremental, and certainly not yet anywhere near adequate.
Dr. Fathi, I'd like to thank you for being here. And if I may be so bold, I'd like to respond to some of the issues here, because when you came on stage, it's about making a change. And what I hear is a lot of people noting this American exceptionalism and defining our humanity by our incarceration rates. And what I would like to point to you, that's a hopeless attitude, folks. The reason things are the way they are is because for political reasons. If you get up and vote, if you get off your apathy, if you change the political system, we can achieve the change that we hope that we can all bring about.
Absolutely.
So I just want to respond to that. If I could.
Amen.
When you said about women being in prison and then getting sexually abused and then raped, why don't they have women just always be in the stall with another woman and make sure they avoid putting them with a man so that never happens?
They're doing that in some states, including this one, that realizing that as long as you have...
I think it is appropriate to put people of different colors in the same stall, but I think make sure they're the same sex.
Exactly, and that's happening in more and more systems.
Probably many of you have heard of Chuck Colson's group, which is the Prison Fellowship. And I don't have the exact name, but I think it was Humaya Prison in Brazil. For 20 years, they've gone in there and they have had a Bible program where they have a mandatory chapel and Bible verses printed all over there and posted all over that place for 20 years, and they have reduced the recidivism rate to about 6%. And in the United States, I think it's up close to 70% after 3 years. The prisoners come back in if they're released. And he said to the head of the ACLU prison project, what would you do if we would try to start a program like that in the United States? And he said, we would sue you, of course.
Well, I don't know who said that. It wasn't me. But it is correct that the ACLU, which is not only interested in prisoners' rights, but in the right of every person to choose their religion or lack of religion, as the case may be, would object to a program of mandatory religious exercise. However, I think it should be possible to take some of the good elements of that program, which sounds like a very successful program, and just make it voluntary and take that element of coercion out of it.
Again, I want to thank you for coming and speaking to us. Excuse me. I wonder if you have any information that you could share as far as people detoxing in jails and treatment, if there's anything, you hear things, and maybe just share a little bit about what's happening with that, with our current opiate epidemic and people getting thrown in jail with drug war continuing.
The first 24 to 48 hours of incarceration, which takes place in a jail, is the most dangerous time. People are detoxing off various substances, legal and otherwise. People usually don't have their prescription medications with them. People are under extreme stress, maybe injured through the encounter with the police that led to their arrest. It's a very dangerous time. The death rates and suicide rates are very high in that first 24 to 48 hours, and untreated detox is a big problem. And jails, many jails, particularly smaller ones in more remote areas, just aren't very good at managing that very serious medical situation. So it's something that we've looked at in the past, and in our jail work we've included that in our lawsuits and tried to make sure that that essential treatment is provided.
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Thank you. We would like to thank you all for coming out. Let's give David another round of applause. For those of you on the way out, the library, the Brooks Library, has provided an exhibit, and they've listed the number of books you could check out of the library dealing with mass incarceration. We also want to remind you to go and take a look at the mass incarceration webpage and be on the lookout, whether it's on social media or traditional media, of the upcoming events throughout the year. And again, thank you very much for coming out.